The Coastwatchers were a ragtag group of Australians and natives that gathered intelligence around the Pacific Island chains north of Australia, helping the Allies win the war against the Japanese in World War II. Today I'll be talking with Volko Ruhnke, who has chosen the Coastwatchers as the subject of one of his next games. Also, Clint Warren-Davey, game designer and teacher of history, will be sitting in to give us the perspective of someone from that part of the world. This is Legendary Tactics.
Yeah, and I thought I'd just jump onto this interview because I'm really intrigued by Coastwatchers and also by the evolution that your designs have taken, Volko, because I know what you have done over time is delve into a lot of the non-kinetic parts of warfare. So you've done counterinsurgency, obviously the coin series, you've done logistics with the levy and campaign series, and now you're delving into intelligence. And all those three aspects had really not been covered in detail by most other wargame designers. And that's what I find really interesting about your designs. And then also the historical theme behind it for Coastwatchers. This is the only game I have ever heard of to cover that topic. And it's really cool for me because I teach history and I'm Australian, obviously, you can tell by the accent. And Australia hopefully you can figure that out. Australia in World War II is a really, really fascinating historical topic.
Absolutely.
I mean, early, especially the time period you're covering, which is 1942. That time for Australia is absolutely critical for us because we had been relying on the British for defense. And when Singapore fell, and the British were also demanding that we send our best troops to North Africa, we felt really abandoned by Britain and we felt under direct threat from Japan. And so that time period is when we switched from being basically aligned with Britain to being aligned with the US because the US was able to commit to the South Pacific. And so we started cooperating with the Americans, and eventually, I mean, we kept our troops in North Africa for a while, but we eventually started transferring units back home to the Pacific Theater because that was where the threat was to our homeland.
Yeah.
So it was actually kind of a traumatic time for Australia because we were under threat, and the mother country had almost abandoned us while still demanding that we send our best divisions to fight the Germans in North Africa, who were not actually a direct threat to us. So at the same time, the Japanese are sort of sending midget submarines to Sydney and bombing Darwin. We have the Australian 9th Division fighting at El Alamein against the Italians and the Germans, whereas we would have much preferred to have them back here, or at least fighting in New Guinea.
Yeah.
And the interesting part is we thought that the Japanese were going to attack us and invade us, but they didn't, partially because they had probed our defenses and realized that we were too strong. But while we were fighting the Japanese in early 1942, before the Americans had arrived in force, we were basically doing it on our own. We hadn't got help from the Americans in a large scale yet. The British had lost Singapore. The Prince of Wales had been sunk. There's effectively no British fleet that can help us out in the Pacific. So we felt like we were fighting Japan on our own. And obviously we're outmatched in terms of numbers and manpower and so on. So this time that you're covering is when we are just starting to cooperate closely with the Americans. The British have left us, and we're having to prove ourselves as a military power, standing on our own feet.
Yeah.
It's such an interesting time for our country. It's traumatic, but by the end of it, we can rely on the Americans. We're going to work with them. The threat to the homeland is gone. Japan is not going to land troops on Australian soil. We've managed to defeat them in New Guinea. We've managed to repel the bombing raids on Darwin. And then with, of course, Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea, the strategic tide starts to turn. And the Coastwatchers playing a role in that is so interesting because there's tiny numbers of guys behind enemy lines that are willing to feed that intel to the American Navy. It's so interesting.
Yeah, and not originally conceived with that purpose, right? So you get this idea of, trained operatives who are, volunteers and go through, all kinds of training and equipping to be inserted behind enemy lines and do their thing. That, and my understanding, the Coastwatchers, that's not the original idea at all. The idea originally in the interwar period is, we don't have a lot of resources. we're looking at the possibility of a military threat, principally from the north. I presume Japan is already kind of looming, certainly by the 1930s, as that threat specifically. And so what we want to have is an economical tripwire. Volunteers, not military personnel, just people who live on the coast, basically, whether it's the north coast of Australia or this outer fence was the term that Eric Feld, the commander of the Coastwatchers, used in the island chains, the colonial mandates to the north, and they're planters, and maybe they're possibly missionaries, businessmen, that kind of thing, who volunteer. They're given then a radio, and the assignment is watch for unusual ships, approaching, and send in those signals so that we get early warning of an invasion, and which they did indeed when it comes to January 1942, and the Japanese are indeed invading that outer fence area. They did exactly that, but then a number of them were taken, of course, but a number of them were not. Who they evaded. The Japanese evaded capture, and then the question was, what now? And the Australian Navy, I guess, decided to ask many of them to just stay in place, commissioned as reserve naval officers in the hope that would keep them from being executed as spies if they were captured, which mostly did not work, and support them as behind the lines intelligence operatives, and in what turned out to be, as we now know, a highly successful program. So really, quite an amazing tale.
How did you, out of all, I know you're famous for picking unusual themes off the beaten track.
Well, coming out of Hunt for Blackbeard, I knew that I could do more along these lines of denial and deception with using blocks in this way, where it's not unit blocks moving across the map, but rather a block showing the status of a position and what's there, and then those blocks being secretly changed out. And so I think a pretty simple mechanic, but not one commonly used, to allow us to do search, reconnaissance in a way that did not give away things it shouldn't give away, which all other systems heretofore, I think, of denial and deception in war games had done to one degree or another. And I thought, well, I want to do something that's about intelligence operations and in wartime. And I'm still mainly interested in military history. And I've long, as many of us are in this hobby, I've long been fascinated with the South Pacific campaign in World War II. And so I knew about Coastwatchers, including from cameo appearances in other game, whether an event card or something, And when I looked at that, I said, well, there's a lot of story here to tell, and there's a lot of dynamic to it. You need both sides doing something and endeavoring if it's going to be a cat and mouse, two-player game. And that was clearly the case here, because the Coastwatchers, while highly effective, were also under tremendous pressure, and the Japanese were sometimes unsuccessful in stopping them, and sometimes quite successful indeed, at least in disrupting them by closing in and forcing them frequently to relocate and so forth, losing their radios and whatever, and sometimes outright capturing them and executing them. So it was a case where there are dynamics here that I want to explore in my game table, and are I thought highly suitable kinds of affairs for experimenting further with this particular block mechanic.
That's interesting. And what about the block mechanic you felt worked really well, is particularly for this specific type of game? So the issue for the Japanese, an issue for the Japanese, is they're aware of the Coastwatchers. In fact, sometimes they know the names of the Coastwatchers on particular islands.
So they're getting intelligence, they're getting information by various means about them, and they're pursuing them. But where on that island? And the Coastwatchers, who are protected by the local people and indigenous people who are helping them move, providing them supplies, and especially providing them warning of the Japanese patrols and the like, mean that it's just very hard that if the Japanese are coming anywhere close, the Coast Watchers can take their transportable. I mean, it's a heavy thing, the teleradios of the day, but you can disassemble it and transport it with carriers up into the hills, and off you go. And it might disrupt your ability to report, but the Japanese are going to have a hard time getting you, because for the Japanese, this was coming into a strange land, and they had their own people who had been there commercially before, but not a lot of them. And it was difficult for the Japanese in many cases to make the connections to the local people that for example, the Australians had. And that meant it's just very hard it's hard to do counterinsurgency if you don't have the inhabitants of a region on your side. And it's similarly hard to do security. It's hard to do counterespionage. And so with that advantage, the Japanese don't know how successful the Coast Watchers are. They don't know that their big naval invasion force that's just sailed out of Rabaul, that the Allies already know it's coming. They don't understand that because there are a pair of very effective Coast Watchers on Bougainville Island, which is 2 hours out from Guadalcanal, that when the Japanese aircraft take off out of Rabaul to head in and tangle with the Cactus Air Force on Guadalcanal, that the Americans on Guadalcanal are getting over 2 hours warning. 40 bombers headed yours.
Yes.
All right. And that means that the Americans can get their slower moving aircraft, slower climbing aircraft, right, their Wildcats, up at altitude and be ready. And when those Japanese bombers come in, they're just going to get massacred. And that happened time and time again. But so what we're trying to do in the game, among that, is show, it's a game about Coast Watchers. They're out there, and you might even know exactly what islands they're on, but that doesn't mean you can catch them. And it doesn't mean that you know how much they've already reported on what you've built up. And you have the opportunity as the Japanese, because I put the Japanese player kind of in a dual role. You're doing security against the Coast Watchers. You're trying to hunt the Coast Watchers down and defeat that intelligence network. But you also have influence over the military operations and the military buildup. And you don't really know then. You have to discern as best you can. You get some information on it, but not total information as the Japanese player. What is known about your dispositions already that might recommend not launching that information, that operation, or might even recommend withdrawing that buildup of military force entirely, because it's so well reported to Allied intelligence by the Coast Watchers that you're not going to gain anything by pursuing it. That's something you have to try to decide and figure out from partial information. And this block system and their face-down counters for the Japanese that work in a similar way allows that to happen. Allows a key element of uncertainty to be, as a Japanese, I don't know how much you as the Allied player know about me and what I'm doing.
I guess I've got another question here, Volko, which is to do with the relationship between intelligence gathering and the time scale. Because when I read the designer's notes for a game like, say, Empire of the Sun by Mark Herman, and I've read a lot of articles about that, that's about the Pacific Theater. And what I noticed is that in the Pacific Theater, you have multiple time scales overlapping, in the sense that aircraft operations happen very quickly. An air operation is measured in hours, and then a naval operation is measured in maybe days, and then a land operation is measured in maybe months. And then what you're talking about with intelligence gathering is you're talking up to a 2-hour warning for influencing the success of an operation.
Yes.
And where those three, so the air, the naval, and the land, because they're operating at such totally different time scales, you've got three totally different scales of intelligence gathering and
Yes.
how up to the minute that intelligence gathering is. And I think that would be the biggest challenge in designing any game on intelligence gathering in the Pacific is managing those widely differing scales. I mean, sometimes it might even come down to a few minutes. Like if you can get warning and get your
Yes.
anti-aircraft guns operational, if you can, or
Yes.
like, changing the type of torpedoes on your torpedo bombers or whatever, it could come down to a matter of minutes or half an hour.
Exactly right. In fact, and I'll address the question about the three levels of time scale because it's a great question, a great issue. But I was pointing this out in the game. Even if you have a coast watcher, even that's in the same space as the target, and the space might be, a third of Guadalcanal or a whole island, in some cases, right? Like Vela La Vela, let's say. That can still be useful warning. It may only be minutes warning, but you've got affirmation that the enemy are coming your way, even if you had earlier warning. And yes, 10 minutes matters. If you have, I've been in a situation where, we had 2 minutes to get from our bunk to the bunker, and then we'd be safe, right? So yeah, absolutely. That minutes of tactical warning is useful. And so if you have a coast watcher, if you had a coast, let's say you're defending Henderson Field, Lunga Point, the middle of Guadalcanal, middle of the North Coast of Guadalcanal, and you had a coast watcher that's behind Japanese lines on the western end of the island, who can send you a signal that the bombers are incoming. Well, it's only minutes, but that's still, they're coming this way. They're coming from this direction. Here they are. And you get very precise, if shorter warning time. Of course, better than that is 2 or 2.5 hours warning they you get from Bougainville. And so we represent that difference as well in the game. So roughly, we can think about or call those three timescales in terms of intelligence, collection, strategic, operational, and tactical. I'm going to say so roughly. Okay. So strategic intelligence might be something like the Americans are decoding Japanese signals, and they figured out that the Japanese are going to make a big thrust at Midway, right? Famous case. And so we know that's coming some days from now or something like that, and we can position our forces accordingly. They're building up forces on this grander scale. Maybe we have weeks of warning, something like that. Operationally, in the South Pacific theater, it might be something like we see a lot of ships coming into Shortlands, Buin, Japanese naval base at the south end of Bougainville. We don't know yet where they're headed. We have some ideas, but we know within days these ships are going to be sailing somewhere, right? And then, so we call that maybe operational warning or operational intelligence, where we're talking about local movement of forces, but it's not an imminent attack. And then we get the hours of they've headed out. Here comes the Tokyo Express is on its way, or, the bombers out of her ball are headed yours, and so forth. And now we have tactical intelligence collection, tactical warning. So in the game, so all of those are represented in the game. The big players are the second two. The strategic warning, that's a lot. The strategic intelligence collection, enemy plans and intentions, overall force levels, war strategy, things like that. That's coming largely through signals intelligence, and I don't know, maybe through some particular human sources or something. That intelligence is so perishable, sensitive, and valuable that it's not being shared with the coast watchers anyway. So to even give you benefit of that as a player, I'm kind of stretching it a little bit. But the idea is you would be advised and you'd be benefiting as in the command of the coast watchers by the more general information you're getting from your headquarters. And so you've got some information just from the scenario, if you will, of what might be on the menu for the Japanese militarily. Okay. That's probably coming ultimately from code breaking. There's also a code breaking asset card you can get where you get to look at those cards. So that's kind of a strategic thing. I don't know exactly what the Japanese player is going to do, but I kind of know this is what they're supposed to do. This is what, whatever Tokyo wants them to do, or Compliant Field Headquarters wants them to do, whatever it is. And I don't know exactly what my opponent is going to do, but this is what they're trying to achieve. That'd be a sort of strategic intelligence. That's sort of a smaller part of the game, but it's in there. The operational is looking for these Japanese buildups at particular. You're actually trying to get eyes on assembly of ships, aircraft, supplies, troops, construction projects. Think about the role of the Coastwatchers in being the first to discover that the Japanese are building an airfield. They're grading, a runway on Guadalcanal that redirects the U.S. effort for a counteroffensive in the South Pacific, the target and the schedule, because the Allies know if the Japanese complete that airfield in Guadalcanal, it's going to be much harder once they've got aircraft flying out of Guadalcanal to invade the Solomon Islands. And so they go ahead and jump in, and we have Operation Watchtower and the Guadalcanal campaign and all that. Well, that report came first from the Coastwatchers, then confirmed by reconnaissance aircraft and other sources, right? That's like operational intelligence. So in the game, you're trying to have your Coastwatchers remain hidden long enough to do these observation actions that can secretly, you hope, spot these Japanese buildups, these military buildups before the Japanese actually can launch anything. And you get victory points for reporting that back to headquarters. Actually reports markers, right? That score for that. That's the operational level. But then on the tactical level, if the Japanese do decide to move militarily now, if they're gonna launch an airstrike, or they're going to launch a naval landing invasion or something else like that, their forces are going to move across the map. We aren't going to resolve. It's not really a game about resolving the military operation. We're not going to resolve the military operation, but we are going to see where does it sail or fly, and how many Coastwatchers do you have along that route to provide that tactical, that hours or minutes of warning. And that's called warning. So that's, instead of reports, that's called warning information. And it was of a different character historically. The typical observation, where it's sort of routine, here's how many ships there are in this port, that kind of thing, what's going on at this Japanese base, is going to be delivered on a routine schedule with coded transmissions, and carefully, cautiously, so that it doesn't betray the location of the Coastwatchers station. But if it's a matter of tactical warning, the enemy aircraft are inbound, then the Coastwatchers were authorized to get on the air. Time is of the essence now, right? It's tactical warning. Hours, minutes matter. Get on the air, and if necessary, in the clear. Don't worry about coding it or anything like that. Get on the air, be brief. 40 bombers headed yours, and give that warning. So we have in the game victory points for the Allied reports. That's the operational time scale, which might probably be days, something like that. And then a whole set of different points that you can score warning, which really is hours to minutes.
I love how you thought that out and broke that down, because that's a very careful breakdown of the nature of it.
And that's the other interesting about the relationship with intelligence and the time scale is that intelligence obviously degrades fairly rapidly, as in you can gather intelligence now, whether that's still relevant or useful tomorrow, you don't know. And that's something I've noticed with games, the few games that do handle intelligence gathering, there has to be a clock where the intelligence will run out of usefulfulness. And I'm wondering, do you have something like that in the game as well?
Yes. And so when you say a clock, that makes me think of PQ-17 by my friend Chris Yanitz, which is the Arctic Convoys, and it's a block game. And it used the blocks in another new way, which was it was how recent was the contact. And that would you'd turn the block to kind of count down. And if it got to all the way around, the block would stand back up and the information was gone, because you'd no longer localize the target because time had passed. So that's absolutely an important principle. So I think in Coastwatchers, it happens organically in this way. The Japanese player has full control over where and what to build up militarily, if anything. They can place supplies here, do construction there, mass aircraft here, warships there, and so forth, or nothing. And they're doing that to score points against mission cards that they have. And they are mission cards drawn from a certain menu that both players know because it's in the scenario. But typically, the Allied player does not know which mission cards exactly the Japanese have drawn, and of those, which mission cards the Japanese player is acting on with placing these build-up markers. It's the build-ups that the Coast Watchers are trying to observe and report on through their actions. And they have to be hidden to do that. If the Japanese are chasing them and they're, revealing them, they haven't necessarily captured them. But if they're on the run, they can't run observation missions to report on them. And if you report on, let's say, a buildup of aircraft at the ball, you get victory points if at the end of the game, it remains accurate. Okay. And the Japanese player can switch these. It costs actions, but the Japanese player can switch. If the Japanese player on turn 1 puts aircraft at Rabaul, player doesn't have to keep them there. Can switch it to ships, can switch it to nothing, to palm trees, right? And so now the Allied player might be thinking, well, I don't have to push my luck as much in the later turns because I've already observed this stuff and I've got points in the bank. But if in fact that information has perished in terms of its intelligence value, its accuracy is no longer what it was, then those points are not going to materialize. And that's in the hands of the two players, is what I mean by organically. So now we get to, if you're the Japanese, are you going to try to pull a trick? Are you going to say, well, because the Japanese moved stuff around to misdirect the Allies, right? To distract from actual operations. I mean, they pulled off deceptions. And in one case, very successfully, which was their evacuation of Guadalcanal in early 43. Because they totally had fooled the Americans, who basically were reading it as a further and yet another Japanese push on Henderson. It was in fact all a cover for getting out, which the Japanese did quite successfully. Anyway, so now as a Japanese player, do you want to get fancy, and use some of your actions to actually misdirect the Allied player as to what you're going to do or how well they are reporting on that information? And the more turns you have, some games might last 2 turns, some games might last 5 turns, largely in the hands of the Japanese player and the scenario. And if you have more turns to play with, there's more room for the Japanese player to, let some information perish, if you like.
Yeah. And that's where neither player knows what the other player knows comes in, right? Because they may have done a big fake out that just wasn't observed anyway. And so when they make their shift, it may not have.
So that's a key. So now this is denial and deception. Right. Denial is, I know I've got efforts to keep you from knowing something about me, and I've successfully kept information about myself from you. Okay, that's denial. Deception is, I've let you see some bit of information, but I've kept control over what you see, or I've at least influenced what you see, and what you see is misleading, right? It might be incorrect information, or it might be selective information that is correct to get you to think something different to my advantage. And that relies on what you said. There has to be a channel, right? If you know nothing about me, I can't deceive you. Right? Yeah, right. Okay. So this is the buildup markers for the Japanese, and also other things. When the Japanese patrol, when they send their army, because the Japanese have basically Japanese Army and Navy land units all over, right? In the occupied areas, there's garrisons everywhere. But in some places, some stations, some islands, they're actively patrolling, they're on security missions, they're looking for spies, they're looking for the Coastwatchers, they're beating the bushes, they're heading up into the hills, right, on patrols. Okay. If they do that, the Coastwatchers hear about it, right? It's known. It's not secret that the Japanese are beating the bushes. The Coastwatchers are protected by their native networks, and they know that the Japanese are looking for them. Okay. So now, as the Japanese, where do you patrol? That's up to you. And you can start off the game with a setup where you've put the patrols here and not there. And that's a signal too. Why is the Japanese patrolling over here and not there? If you're the Allies, right? Because the Japanese know where they're patrolling, and they're going to patrol typically in order to secure that area against Coastwatchers spying on them, because there's something important happening there. Is there? Or is the reason they put the patrol there so you're going to invest? You see what I'm saying? Yeah. So there are channels thereby in the game to let the player see something. Let your opponent see some things that are selective. And when a coast watcher does in the game does an observe action, it might be completely successful and secret. That is, the Japanese know the coast watcher did an observe action somewhere in the South Pacific and succeeded, but don't know where, because we're going to ask the Japanese player to close your eyes briefly, and the ally player looks at the buildup counter and sees if there's anything there, and then marks the report. That might be the case, or it might be the case that it's partially successful in the sense of you got your report, you observed, but I saw you looking at me. I got a report that you had, that you were close within view of my base, and you've exposed yourself. And it doesn't mean I can catch you necessarily, because you're probably going to relocate as soon as I come up after you. But I know you saw me, right? That also is possible. And so now we've got, okay, so the Japanese player did a buildup somewhere. Is it been spotted or not? Don't know. There were some observation missions. Now they've stopped. I mean, anyways, there's a lot of room there for the uncertainty to be about what does the other player know about me?
Yeah.
Mm.
And did you were you able to work in any of the individual coast watchers into the design, like Paul Mason and Jack Reed and that sort of thing, or even some of the native people that were protecting them?
Yeah, and of course, as as Clint, as you mentioned, we've got these really small numbers of individuals, and so they're well-known names. If you read the stories, it's not really a matter of big units. I mean, it's a program, and there are hundreds and maybe thousands of people involved, but there are individuals, and yes, I did, and that's mainly through the asset cards that both sides have, in which some of them are units and equipment and support of various kinds. I mentioned code breaking for the Allies, for example, PT boats and submarines, zeros and destroyers, and all the kinds of units and forces that you would expect to inhabit the South Pacific in World War II are in the asset cards. And also some of these remarkable individuals, some are Australians. At least one I can think of is New Zealander, Kennedy at Segi.
Basically the same thing. Yeah. New Zealander, basically the same thing. Australia, New Zealand.
Same thing. All right. Yeah. Yeah. And
not
so,
sure if they'd say that, but yeah.
Right. And so you mentioned Jack Reed and Paul Mason. So they're a card that give you more effective abilities, but they're localized. They're on Bougainville, which is it's like a key choke point, in the Solomon Islands, and it's that in the game as well. And so that's like they're limited in geography, but they're very capable there if you have them. And then, as you mentioned, it was very clear at the time, and very clear to historians to this day, as we've talked about, that the key to success or failure for both sides in this intelligence struggle was, what are the loyalties of the indigenous people, the Solomon Islanders, the Papuans, other Melanesians who live there, and don't necessarily have a reason to side with one or the other at the outset, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a colonial presence over them. There's a strong missionary presence, Christianizing them. And then comes another colonial presence in the form of the Japanese. And now, what is the posture if you're living there under Japanese occupation? And different communities make different choices over time. And the Coast Watchers Command knew very well that their ability to do their mission relied on sympathies of these people, full stop. Without that, they had to evacuate. And in fact, the great, Reed and Mason, you mentioned, in 1943, they were under so much pressure by the Japanese that they had to be extracted from Bougainville, along with all the Australian commandos who'd been there, And the principal reason was that the Japanese over time were succeeding in gaining the cooperation of the Bougainville Islanders. But working against that are certain policemen, typically Sergeant Yuika on Bougainville, Vuza on Guadalcanal, and others who were quite heroic in their commitment to the Allied cause against the Japanese. And so they're represented in the game as well, as, again, very powerful assets on principally on the side of the Allies. But that doesn't mean, of course, there were not pro-Japanese indigenous people as well. And if I had names of personalities and individuals in the record, and I've been frustrated actually how little I've been able to find actually from the Japanese perspective on this, I would have used them. But I know that we know quite a bit about where pro-Japanese sentiment built up, where it was strong and decisive against the Coastwatchers, and that's of course in the game as well as asset cards for the Japanese side.
I'll tell you that the focus on individuals, like named individuals, as a factor in really like a strategic or an operational level conflict. That's what I found most interesting because, and I'm going to take a bit of a tangent here, but you'll see what I mean. Some of my favorite games are not historical at all. They're the games like Star Wars Rebellion, War of the Ring, Twilight Imperium, and so these fantasy sci-fi games which are not historical. But the appeal of those games is that you have a strategic level military conflict with big armies fighting, and then underneath that, you have individuals, named heroic individuals doing little side missions that influence the bigger struggle. And there's very few historical games that have that. But I think what you've shown is that the main way that you can incorporate heroic individuals doing cool little side missions, I don't know if there's a single word for this, but that's what I'm thinking, and you can incorporate that with strategic level dudes on a map, armies fighting each other. Mm-hmm. The link there is intelligence gathering. If you want to do a realistic historical game where named individuals matter, and them doing cool little side missions matters, intelligence gathering is the link between those two things in a real historical setting.
And that's their John Rambo.
Yeah, well, that's right, and that's because that's the thing about Rambo is that Rambo's a joke because no one man wins a war. That's why it's funny. Like by shooting lots of enemies. Like in modern warfare, that doesn't happen. Maybe in medieval warfare, you could have one man is decisive, maybe. But in 20th century industrial warfare, you don't have heroes that go around killing large numbers of enemies and deciding a battle. It's maybe for propaganda purposes and that's it. But you do have named individuals that can influence the conflict at the strategic level through intelligence gathering. And that's the link that you've made. And I don't know if many other historical games have that, but it's something I'd like to see more of. Is that link? Does that make sense? I know I've got on a fantasy sci-fi tangent.
I actually hadn't ever thought of it that way, but I think it does make sense in that certainly we have individuals when we're talking about, mass firepower, right? Units and fleets and armies and bombardments and things. Then if we think about individuals, it's typically going to be elites.
Yeah.
Leaders, commanders, politicians, that kind of thing. So certainly the coin series games, many of the event cards are individuals who are useful, but that's usually who they are, right? They're typically political, military, economic elites who move a lot of resources, right? Because we're talking here about things on a national scale and industrial scale, and who moves resources? Elites move resources, and this elite moved these resources in a better way than somebody else, and so they get recorded in the books. But what's interesting about what you say, and what makes it seem true to me, is if it's information, right? A small piece of information can have a decisive effect. It doesn't mean you have to move a lot of resources. It's just moving this piece of information, like they just took off, and they're headed your way, or they're gonna be going east, not south, or whatever it is. They have this technology that you didn't know they had, right? a single individual's actions can deliver a decisive piece of information that then makes the movement of all those resources much more effective. And so I think there's something to that, that when we look at intelligence, reconnaissance, manhunting in the case of Hunt for Blackbeard, that kind of thing, where it's an information struggle, right? It's not really a struggle about firepower. And that's a dichotomy. I mean, we taught insurgency and counterinsurgency. One of the principles was information advantage and firepower advantage. So typically the counterinsurgents have firepower advantage and the insurgents have information advantage, right? The insurgents typically start off with just a person, a few enthusiasts get together, they form cells, eventually they have networks, eventually they have guerrilla units, but the government has, in the beginning, the monopoly on force and still has the preponderance of firepower, right, as you're fighting the rebellion. But the problem for the government is, they can eliminate with their firepower, they can eliminate the enemy insurgents if they know who they are and where they are.
Yeah.
But they don't, because the latter, the insurgents, have that information advantage, typically because they're being protected by people, by the population who's not sympathetic to the government in that area. And so the insurgents have to take advantage of the fact that while they don't have the firepower, they do have the information. And so now you can get into those situations where, just a key person can overturn that advantage, perhaps, on behalf of the counterinsurgency. And if you're going to do reconnaissance and intelligence affairs, then, well, it's all about information. That's the game, right? And we're trying, despite, in the case of the Coastwatchers against the Japanese, of course, in their own areas, the Japanese have vast firepower advantage, and the Coastwatchers are dependent on maintaining that information advantage to do their mission, and which they, as it turned out, did very well. And that can involve a very small number of people who have a very decisive effect, and so you get the Halsey quotation that the Coastwatchers saved Guadalcanal and Guadalcanal saved the South Pacific. You have this idea of a handful of individuals, being decisive in the movement of great fleets and armies, right? I mean, that's contained in Halsey's observation.
Yeah, it almost reminds me of this again. It's to go on the same tangent as before. You know why the original Star Wars movie begins with Darth Vader's trying to find Princess Leia because she has the Death Star plans and she has to sneak the Death Star plans.
Right.
I mean, it's a bit of a trite example, but I mean that's about
espionage. It's espionage. Yeah,
yeah, that's what it is. Because you see these giant Star Destroyers and whatever.
Well, you say it's a trite example, but these, and I have a whole talk on this actually, called Paper Time Machines, and it looks at Star Wars Rebellion, the game, and War of the Ring, the game.
Yep.
And Dune, the original six-player Dune, and talks about those fantasy sci-fi settings as containing dynamics that are from history, that are from real life.
Yeah.
Because these writers, when they created coherent world where this fictional conflict is going to play out, where are they getting these dynamics from? Right?
Yeah.
From human experience, I mean, they're not made up out of whole cloth. They're modeled on history, right? On real life. And so it's not surprising that we have an insurgency going on in Star Wars, and there's hidden rebel bases, and there's espionage going on. And if only the Empire with the firepower advantage can find out who and where the rebels are, it can eliminate the threat. It can win the war. And the rebels, therefore, have to be sneaky and stealthy and build up slowly and strike and raid here and there and relocate their base if it's discovered. I mean, you see all that happening in insurgency and counterinsurgency. It's bread and butter, right? So the point of that talk was, we can, from these fictional worlds, if they're well written, if they're well conceived and coherent, it's probably because there are real life dynamics in them, right? Of course, delivered to us in a very entertaining package, but that's fine. And so the game Dune, despite there's a war economy going on that's very interesting, and not unlike what you see in other historical conflicts. And in War of the Ring, I was talking about medieval, what is it that brings about medieval battles, the role of fortifications, armies, sieges, and siege relief. So I compared the Star Wars Rebellion to Fire in the Lake and just showed like common elements, and Dune to Falling Sky about the Gauls and Caesar, and the war economy that's underway there, and War of the Ring to Nevsky in the Living Campaign series, just to kind of show the the historical dynamics are common to each.
So when's the Star Wars coin game coming out?
Right. Yes. Well, we couldn't get the license for that. We did try. We have one, actually. We did design one, my son and I, but unfortunately, I think Lucasfilm was not going to let that happen.
Yeah.
I'm afraid.
That's funny that you mentioned the firepower advantage and the information advantage, because that's something that I've had to take into account. Not to, again, sorry to derail it away from Coastwatchers again, but I'm working on a game on the Polish underground in World War II. So this is kind of an insurgency espionage type of theme. And the mistake I had made with it originally is I had looked at the Warsaw Uprising as an example of an insurgents carrying out an operation. And I had thought, okay, well, the insurgents are capable of putting tens of thousands of men in the field, and they're able to fight the Germans in a battle. And I thought, well, that if they can do that, then they can contest the Germans and the Soviets for actual military control of Poland. And then the more research I've done and the advice I've gotten from other designers is, no, that the Warsaw Uprising is not the norm. It would be like looking at the Tet Offensive and saying, oh, the Viet Cong can attack all the cities in South Vietnam in a direct conventional military way when they choose to. But it's not the case. The Warsaw Uprising and the Tet Offensive take months and months of planning. It's a huge buildup. And then all of those units are effectively destroyed and they can't do it again. So you have to switch back to, no, you do not have anywhere near the firepower advantage. You only have that information advantage. And so I've actually had to change the design such that the Polish underground effectively get one or two chances to do a big uprising where they might be able to take control of one space. But beyond that, it is all espionage, intelligence, building up support with the local population, trying to gather supplies and so on. So it's really interesting that you bring that up, that the firepower advantage and the information advantage, you've got to keep that front and center. If you're an insurgent or you're the espionage, or you're the Coastwatchers, you're the rebels, you're the underdog, you do not have the means to contest the overdog directly. And
you've
so
got,
interesting to hear you say that.
You're trying to get to that. Right.
Yeah.
In the end, you're trying to get to that, and you're relying on what? Typically, in an insurgency, you're relying on the people. So the next step in the lesson was, well, if the government has a firepower advantage, but they need the information, where do they get the information? Well, from the people. If you get this is what the Japanese are doing in the Solomons, right? If you can get the people who live there ultimately to cooperate with you, they can point out to you who the insurgents are and where they are, right? And to use your firepower. Where do the insurgents get the firepower ultimately because ultimately they have to outgun the government, otherwise they're never going to win, right? Where do they get that from? And typically that's also from the people. They're slowly, like you say, they're slowly gathering the resources and building the loyalty until they have the ability to stand up in the final, in the Maoist conception, the mobile phase of war, where they actually are going to start taking over places. But the moment of that is difficult to achieve, and very often, and perhaps Warsaw is an example of this, and the Tet Offensive is an example of this, very often you're tempted to pull that trigger too soon, right?
Yeah.
And then you've given up your information advantage. In other cases, it's outside powers where you have a sponsor, right?
Yes.
And the idea is we're going to rise up, not to take over the whole place ourselves, but because that's going to help make it possible for in cooperation with the outside sponsor. It's almost like if you think about, Market Garden or something, like the Airborne can't do it on its own. They got to have 30 Corps coming up the highway, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the same thing here. If you rise up in Warsaw, you want the Soviets to punch through and connect with you, know, right? Well, that didn't happen, and so it fails. And so that's another the final theory, but it's it's largely discredited, I think, is the Volko theory from Che Guevara, and that is that if you've got a population that's unhappy enough, you might not be able to recruit them all with slow building up, surrounding the cities in a Maoist fashion. But if you do something dramatic militarily, it will inspire them. So the theory was that's how they won the Cuban Revolution. And then he tried to apply that in Bolivia, and it was a complete bust. So that might be another reason you do that, but you are expending, you're expending your information advantage when you rise up like that. And so I think you're absolutely right in terms of your model for your game, that's going to be something you build up for a long time and then decide to pull the trigger, and it's a big risk when you do.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, and especially because in that particular setting, the direction it's going now is we have 4 different Polish factions within the underground. So it's a 4-player game. You're all factions within the underground, and you all have to work together. And you are trying to fight the Germans. Then the Soviets come in, and the Soviets are going to be arresting your guerrillas and crushing you. And you're hoping the Allies can airdrop supplies to help you, but that's not reliable. Even the Germans can often capture those supplies. So the decision to pull the trigger on the uprising is all dependent on timing, and it's dependent on these other outside. And part of the other reason of the Warsaw Uprising is they can take Warsaw before the Soviets arrive, and then say to the Allies and to the Soviets, "We are an independent country again." So we have international diplomatic recognition of an independent Polish state because we control the capital before the Soviets get there. Which is of course they are not able to do that because the Germans defeat them in Warsaw, and then the Soviets come in and take Warsaw, and the Soviets arrest them all.
Right.
So their timing was wrong. Their timing and their
but that's interesting to make it a factional thing, because I imagine that's a big debate internally, right, in a movement.
Yeah,
it is. Are we ready to pull the trigger? Is this right? Because it's such a momentous decision, right?
Yeah.
But it's something that you got to do. It's almost eventually you got to use all this firepower you've been building. You want to use it for something, right? And so we have to pull the trigger sometime. Is the moment now or not? And I imagine that's a repeated debate throughout history in insurgent movements.
Yeah.
Interesting. So just to bring things back to Coastwatchers for a moment. So obviously the game is going to raise the profile of the Coastwatchers, among gamers, certainly. Why don't you think they have a bigger profile now? How come they feel almost lost to the...
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I was aware of what Coastwatchers were and what their role. And as I said, they make cameos, and they're an event card in Empire of the Sun by Mark Herman, for example. So I don't know. I guess I don't know how known or unknown they really are, except that they're not. They're not causing things to blow up directly. And not only are they not like planes dropping bombs and torpedoes and all that kind of thing that we usually focus on when we think about warfare. They're not kinetic, and I think non-kinetic. I think Clint, you already had used that phrase for some of my games. They're not kinetic, and in fact, they were expressly non-kinetic. That is to say, they were generally prohibited from the temptation of undertaking resistance at all, because they had their local networks, right? And they had not just informants and spies and canoemen, and they had policemen who were former policemen on the islands. They had in effect guerrilla units protecting them, but they were only to be used, with exceptions. They were to be used in self-defense against security, not to be some sort of insurgency sabotage campaign, right? Which is often paired with in intelligence, because you have the information, you have the local network. So let's use that to blow something up. And the idea was that their information is so valuable that we're not going to pull that trigger generally. And in fact, the name of the program itself, of the Australian program, was Ferdinand. And it was for the cartoon character, the bull, who just wanted to relax in the sunshine and sniff flowers, and not fight anybody until somebody attacks him. Then he fights back, right? So Ferdinand was actually the Australians' name for the program of the Coastwatchers in that area. Now, There were absolutely. There were Australian commandos who worked with them. There were guerrilla actions, and there were exceptions to that rule, especially as the war goes on. So in the game, you get a lot more guerrilla resistance by the Coastwatchers in 1943 than you do in 1942. But fundamentally, that was not what they were. That was not what they're about. So they're just not kinetic. They're just not doing exciting, like movie things like blowing up enemy things. They are doing quiet work by design. They're avoiding contact. They're observing. They're radioing. They're receiving deliveries of bags of rice so that they don't have to come out of the hills. It's low key, I guess. I don't know
JFK.
Yeah, right. Yes, exactly. Which, again, it's by means of having a network out there of local people in canoes who will spot Allied castaways, naval crew, and down pilots before the Japanese do. And that was so successful that, if you were a pilot shot down in Japanese territory and Japanese waters in the South Pacific, you'd have a much better chance of freedom and survival if you were an Allied pilot being shot down behind Japanese lines than if you were a Japanese pilot shot down behind Japanese lines. Think about that, right? And that's because of how robust, at least in the Solomons, where was the weight of this, at least in the Solomon Islands, how robust this quiet network, Allied network headed up by the Coastwatchers was.
I think it's interesting that here in Australia, Volko, I'm a history teacher. We teach kids Australian military history. So when they're in 9th and 10th grade, they will spend probably 6 months of their history learning on World War I, and then another roughly the same amount of time on World War II in history. But in looking at the curriculum that we have here, I don't even think the Coastwatchers are mentioned as a dot point or even a footnote in the syllabus of what we have to teach. Having said that, after talking with you guys today, I'm going to teach a lesson on it.
Great.
Even if it's not in there, because I think it's worth a lesson for the points you've just said. Because if we're going to learn about, they learn about the Kokoda Trail, and they learn about El Alamein and all that, and the home front and all that kind of stuff, and then they learn about the Pacific theater overall. But it seems that if we're going to teach them about, say, the Coral Sea or Guadalcanal, the whole South Pacific campaign, there should be some education on the Coastwatchers, because it's such an interesting story. And I think it will actually inspire some of these kids that I teach to learn more about World War II, because like what I said, it's individuals impacting the big level military stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's definitely worth teaching about. And I think a lot of people will find it very, very interesting.
Yeah. And are you familiar with a website called The Last Coast Watcher in that regard?
No, I'm not.
Check it out. There is a Coast Watcher. He served as a Coast Watcher in 44 on New Britain, and who's still alive. He just turned 101 years old.
Oh, wow.
And he seems to have dedicated his retired life to memorializing that information. So and so he knows about the game and has been very supportive actually of the game project. As is funny enough, the grandniece of Eric Felt, the commander of the Coastwatchers, who also very kindly corresponded with me about the game. So the I guess the supporters of keeping that history alive and making it more known are out there, and Australian War Memorial also seems to have, at least in terms of photography, a lot of material on the Coastwatchers.
One thing I wanted to ask, I don't want to keep you too much longer because I know you it's getting a bit late, but you mentioned earlier about the kind of the through line. So starting with Hunt for Blackbeard through the Coastwatchers, then on to Dakan. What do you see? I know I'm mispronouncing that. But what do you see as the progression of the evolution? What did you start with Blackbeard that
right?
and how did that progress through those three designs? Because
Yeah.
in a way, I see it as a parallel, but between kind of what happened with the coin series. You started out with the Andean Abyss, and it evolved through, the various iterations until Falling Sky, or maybe Fire in the Lake.
Yeah, and even earlier with Labyrinth, the War on Terror, which someone else had said it's kind of proto coin, but sort of a game about counterterrorism, and we had to deal with hidden intelligence terrorist cells, and the intelligence of going after them and disrupting them, and that those mechanics were useful in the coin series for guerrillas being active or hidden, and so on. And so in a way, this progression is similar, but to do specifically with denial and deception. And Blackbeard, Hunt for Blackbeard, actually came from an earlier design I'd done professionally, co-design at work as a training game for analysts. And that game was called Kingpin, and it was about the Mexican hunt for El Chapo, Joaquin Guzman, the Sinaloa drug cartel leader, who was a very hard target, and the Mexican and specialized Mexican Navy unit actually managed to, hunt him down and keep him in prison for 6 months before he escaped again. And there was a second manhunt for El Chapo. Anyways, I'd done a game about, that 10 years ago now, and thought I'd like to do something like that for the hobby world from history. And so the Hunt for Blackbeard in North Carolina in 1718 had all those elements where I could play with kind of manhunting theory, which I knew, and in game form, but that required having there be some way for the hunters to have informants who were telling them something about where Blackbeard was and what he was doing without the Blackbeard player knowing it. And so how do we do that? Which when you go back, and I have an article in this issue of C3I number 37 about this, when you go back and look at games going back to Battleship, which is a war game, that really simplifies down like what is the essence of naval operations in the Pacific in World War II. It's where is the enemy, right? And we're gonna just do that. And Bismarck and the operational system within Jutland and lots of other games like that, in which you had search going on using all kinds of mechanics like screens and notation of where things were, but you always had to call out where you were searching. If you search somewhere, your opponent knows you searched there because they have to answer you to say, so I was trying to get around that with Hunt for Blackbeard, and that's where this came about. Eventually we hit upon having blocks that were just a position, and if I had an informant that could look there secretly, I just asked you to close your eyes. I looked at the block and put it back, and now I see is Blackbeard there or not. So that was manhunting. And from there, intelligence operations. And I kind of talked about why I thought Coastwatchers was a good wartime field intelligence story and dynamic to explore with that same mechanic. And then from there, reconnaissance, which is a little different than intelligence, but you can see manhunting, field intelligence, reconnaissance, military reconnaissance, right? They're all about information, really, at the end of the day. They're all, where's the enemy? Where's the enemy going to be? What are they doing? Same questions, really. And I've very long been fascinated by trench warfare, and just as an amazing phenomenon, the Western Front in World War I, and trying to figure, and it's something which we, as war gamers early on, we come to, well, it's so static. How interesting can it be? Let's just do 1914 or 1918, not 1915, 1917 is, boring. Nothing moves. But in fact, the dynamics of the battles are extraordinarily complex, rich. There's learning going on both sides. The tactics are evolving, the technology is evolving, and it still ends up fundamentally geographically a stalemate at the end, but within that is so much motion and interest. So I've long loved to play games about that. And I was inspired by Kurt Keckley's Fields of Despair, which takes hidden block unit strengths. It's a classic block game in a way, but on the Western Front, you have just a solid line of blocks, north to south, as you might imagine. This is the Western Front. And you can have up to 3 blocks in each space. And each block can be between 0 and 20 strength points. And once a turn, both sides get to completely rearrange those blocks any way they like, right? It's just wild, right? And so when I'm looking at your front line, a specific hex in your front line might have 60 strength points in it, or it might have 0. They're all dummies. But if I fly an airplane over it, I can look at it if you don't beat me off with your airplanes. Okay, fantastic. And works very well. And reveals a fundamental aspect of trench warfare, which was cavalry's we always relied on cavalry for reconnaissance. I'm sorry, machine guns, wire, trenches, artillery, cavalry is useless. It's not going to give you any intelligence. All you know about what your enemy is doing is what you can see along his front line, right? Almost nothing. You're almost completely blind all of a sudden to everything behind the enemy's front line in this static warfare. And so getting up in the air is a really big deal. And that's what all this stuff about Richthofen and aces and Bloody April and all this, all these tales of knights in the air. Why are they maneuvering at and shooting at each other? It's all about who has the ability to fly over the enemy's territory and look down, right? Yeah. It's huge. In other words, reconnaissance is highly determinative of battle outcomes. And you had Bloody April in 1917 precisely because even though the Germans had a tactical advantage with Richthofen's flying circus and all that, the Royal Flying Corps absolutely had to obtain that dominance to protect the Arras offensive, right? And so they said, we're just going to take this loss. We have to take this loss in pilots and planes. Okay, so isn't that a fascinating story to get at why air was so important? And then there's other things so that's the next game, right after Coastwatchers. It does that at the Battle of Verdun.
That's so interesting that how you describe World War One. It's not boring. There's not a lot. It looks like there's not a lot of movement, but there's actually a lot going on. And I've thought that for a long time. Like I love World War One games, like Paths of Glory was one of my favorite games. But it's interesting how wargamers have neglected it as boring. Whereas a lot of people are really interested in, say, medieval siege warfare, which is fundamentally about static positions facing off of it. But for some reason, medieval siege warfare is really, really, really interesting, and people love talking about trebuchets and catapults and battering rams and starving out the enemy and all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to trench warfare, it's like, oh, that's just lines of guys staring at each other doing nothing. But it's not doing nothing. You're actually doing a lot. And right, especially as Australians, like that was World War I was a big deal for us, and Australians were renowned for our ability to do trench raids, like nighttime trench raids and all that kind of stuff, which is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and that fascinated me too. Trench raids. I feel like we're in this situation where we're relatively safe in our trenches and dugouts. In between, we have no man's land, and there's barbed wire and machine guns and all that. And what are we going to do tonight? Guys, we're going to take, a dozen of us. We're going to go up into that no man's land, go to where the enemy is strong in his trenches, and we're going to jump in there and attack him. Isn't that crazy? I mean, it sounds crazy. Why was it so important? Because you were so desperate for reconnaissance. You were so desperate for information. Just who are the guys? They're a couple hundred yards away only, but who are they? Right? Let's go if we can just get a prisoner or a collar patch or something. That's important information. And so these trench raids were going on all the time. So that's in the game as well. So you've got all that air, balloons and all that stuff, the Drachenballon, but also trench raids for that reason, because it's one of the few ways, there isn't that much, there's some, but not that much signals intelligence. A lot of the operation communications are landline because it's static positions, right? So it's hard to intercept enemy communications too, right? So how do you get information on plans? And they had to basically try to sneak into the other guy's fortifications and steal them, with the trench raids, right? Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know why, the siege aspects, I've also been always interested in siege warfare of all kinds. And it's maybe less popular, I think, than mobile campaigns and field battles. But I think particularly for World War I, it's perhaps in the war game hobby because we have World War II. if I'm
Yeah.
if I'm going to go to the earlier part of the 20th century, for a big war in Europe, give me the one where there are tank divisions, running around surrounding. Why would I go to World War One with the sieges? I guess. I mean, I suppose that's part of why.
Yeah. Good. Anyway, did you have any other last questions, Clint, or anything like that? I don't want to keep Volko too long. I really appreciate it.
No, I'm good. I think I think I've asked everything I wanted to ask, and it's been a great conversation. I've learned a lot, and very much looking forward to Coastwatchers. So
Thanks.
Yeah.
I appreciate your observations on it. Were awesome on online, and appreciate this opportunity to bang things about.
And what's the timeline? So Blackbeard, then Coastwatchers, then Dachen. Any
Well,
idea?
it depends on the support. So Hunt for Blackbeard is with Fort Circle Games. There's the art is well along, but not completed. So when that package is together, Fort Circle Games will launch a Kickstarter, and then I think it will depend on how that Kickstarter goes. Hopefully that's soon, like weeks, not months from now. Coastwatchers is still in playtest and development. And I'm just now working. In fact, I have on the table in front of me set up a solitaire system by popular demand, so that you can, go up against a non-opponent, just like in the coin series. Simpler though, and then that's with GMT Games, so it's on the P500 page. So it's going to depend on people being interested enough in the game to go to the P500 page and commit, not pay now, but commit to buy the thing when it comes out. And if the orders go well, it'll be sooner. If they don't go so well, it'll be later or never.
I have a feeling with your reputation, hitting the P500 is pretty much a given.
Oh, we'll see. We'll see.
Anyway, yeah. So thanks again for taking the time to chat with us, and thank you, Clint, for plugging in as well. As you had some great questions there that I wouldn't have thought of. So that was really great.
yeah,
And
always a pleasure.
yeah, so awesome.
Thank you both.